The Africa Gemstones and Jewellery exhibition and conference is underway in Ndola, Zambia. The event is aimed at showcasing various types of gemstones as well as promote intra-Africa trade in that industry. We're now joined by Mkhululi, Ncube, African Minerals Development Center Program Officer, to tell us more about some of the value chains and the future. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. How would you characterize the Africa gemstone landscape on the continent?
Thank you, Brenda. Unfortunately, it seems it's not seems, it is what it is, and we are attempting to change that. The gemstone landscape on the continent is always geared towards getting the gemstones out of the continent. This is something that we need to change, and of course, if we anchor on the Continental Free Trade Agreement, as well as the area that's going to be produced thereby, we will definitely get to change the landscape on the continent. So this is what we are trying to do with the Gemstone Jewellery and Exhibition Conference.
Because how has that worked for the continent, right? Getting them from the ground and getting them out of this here particular continent, in whose benefit has it been traditionally? Exactly.
If you think of that, the fact that the Africa Mining Vision is anchored on changing that narrative, it's time we actually walked that talk itself. So it's not going to help us. We do not have value chains. We do not have watchmakers on the continent because no one understands that gemstone and jewellery sector actually includes making watches, right? If we are going to constantly be getting Tissot watches, I mean, there's nothing wrong with them, but it's time we had our own African brands that we know when a person comes to Botswana, comes to South Africa, gets to Tanzania, they're going to get a brand that is purely African using African gemstones.
Does that include having some really difficult conversations about how we do that, especially when you take a look at the value chains, right? So it's one thing to have a watchmaker. It's another thing to have somebody that actually unearths the minerals, and you take a look at their quality of life. In South Africa, for instance, there's a conversation about artisanal mining, but it's also called people who are zamazamas, where there's a lack of regulation, but it is going on and on and on. You need to think of the Democratic Republic of Congo and some of the images that we are made to see or understand, where even young children are used to unearth some of these minerals.
So I have a very unpopular job of ensuring that this whole artisanal and small-scale mining narrative, right, is changed within our minds. Everybody knows exactly what you're talking about, the unfortunate environmental detriments that are aligned to it, the child labor that's aligned to it, the illegalities and the irregularities that are aligned to it. But the reason why it constantly persists, right, is it's actually a livelihood activity. And as much as people do not want to accept that, it is what it is. It's like telling the woman, and I always give this unfortunate and very painful example. No one actually tells the woman who sells vegetables by the corner to regularize and get a license for doing it. Because to her, that's a livelihood activity, right? And then when women are, and then when people are trying to do the same with minerals, because they've seen that there are people who want these minerals, right? It then becomes a whole issue of why are they illegal? Why are they there? Let's call them the Zamazamas. In Zimbabwe, they're the Korokozas. In Ghana, they are the Galamsey, you know. This is a narrative that we're going to change as the African Minerals Development Center. The Africa Mining Vision wants to change that narrative and let us look at it in a way that, thank goodness, Gemstone and Jewellery actually does touch on the minerals that are touched on by ASM. We are intending to change this narrative. It's a hard discussion to have, but it needs to be had, and we need to change.
Because that leads to my next question. How, right? Where is it working? And where can we exchange ideas and learn from each other?
So, fortunately, for the bulk of the people who are here, we're talking about gemstone and jewelers who are aligned to the value chain that is linked to artisanal and small-scale mining, right? And this is from 15 countries. So we have 16 countries represented in today, including Zambia. And these are gemstone and jewellery value chain players that are also linked to ASM. And by so doing, they are going to learn from each other. We at AMDC, the Minerals Development Center, we have fortunate linkages to knowing what is working where, what doesn't work where the similarities are. And so thanks to AGIC, we are going to ensure that when they talk to each other, what is working in Zambia will definitely work in Tanzania. And that which is failing in Ghana is something that will have a solution that will come from Ethiopia. So these are the conversations we're going to be having during these next 4 days at AGIC here. And the issue of how, there is definitely no one-size-fits-all. Each country has its own dynamics, and that is why we're bringing in 16 countries to talk to each other about it.
When we take a look, you mentioned the environment. There are issues of deforestation while we are trying to get the minerals out. But also we understand that there is chemical smuggling. What does that even mean?
So chemical smuggling would be, for instance, when you process, right, some of these, well, let's take gold, for instance. So there are countries that are actually going to be stringent on ensuring that you don't bring in chemicals such as mercury, right, within the country. But of course, across our porous borders, it means if you can get it in one country, you are literally going to move into the other country to ensure that you can still process your gold using mercury. It's unfortunate that at the end of the day, the environment and the people do suffer, regardless of where you're actually going to be processing this gold using mercury. So that's part of the so-called chemical processing that exists, especially when it comes to artisanal and small-scale mining.
Please allow me to digress as I think of perhaps on the heritage side of things, you've got these growing calls for looted African art, and that goes along with some of these gemstones that were also looted that sit on heads of kings and queens elsewhere outside of this continent. Is this something that you're also taking a look at?
No, not at all. The reason being that's a conversation that we will not be having at this point, right? Those gemstones, rubies, diamonds that left back in the day, fair and fine. Let them stay there. But the good thing is, if we then start valuing our own value chains now and start growing the value addition on the continent, it means we can make 1,000 of those crowns and be keeping them on the continent, right? And we should not worry about it. The only the major problem that is there is we're trying to rewrite history. We need to create history. And this is what we are thinking we are doing at this point in time.
So countries from Zambia, Tanzania, Namibia, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Botswana, and Mozambique are rewriting history. What are some of the things that we're seeing from these countries, right? So especially when we speak about innovation. You mentioned that we don't have watchmakers on this continent, but what do we have?
Well, we do have watchmakers on this continent. So being showcased at this particular AGIC, we have one watchmaker from Botswana called Nako Timepieces. He is trying to innovate. I mean, anyone can look him up. I'm sure this is free publicity for him. Anyone can look him up. We are looking at it and saying they bring Nako Timepieces to Ethiopia. Then they ensure that Ethiopian opal is actually involved in Nako timepieces. There is a brand in Senegal called Matidi. That's a watchmaker brand, a local African watchmaker brand in Senegal. We want to be working with those as well. So with Nako timepieces here, and then Matidi joining us in Lagos in 2 months' time when we're having the Lagos chapter series of AGIC. And then they also join us in Ghana at Gold Statement for the Ghana version series of AGIC. We are ensuring that these timepieces start having the level of recognition that is African, and then in due course we will grow more watchmakers. So that's just one example of how we want to ensure that AGIC changes the narrative.
So that speaks to the African continental free trade.
Exactly. You move Nako timepieces, they are sold right next to Matidi in Senegal. You move Senegal Matidi down to Southern Africa, Botswana, South Africa, name it. Then you have a section where you understand we have watchmakers on the continent and they're being showcased all over the continent.
Fantastic stuff. Mkhululi Ncube is the African Mineral Development Center Program Officer. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.